While sovereign SATCOM systems are not a new idea, sovereignty has become a critical issue in the satellite industry over the past year, as geopolitical trends push nations to want more control over their communications and space data. In this episode, I'm joined by Keith Blanchet, VP of Global Government for ST Engineering iDirect, to dig into this trend. Keith gives insight into the challenges that nations are working through as they make decisions about sovereign networks, like affordability, local expertise, and also covers how commercial providers work closely with nations to meet their needs. He also talks about how multi-orbit orchestration plays a key role as nations look to build hybrid architectures and partner with their allies. I'd like to thank ST Engineering iDirect for sponsoring this conversation. I'm Rachel Jewett, and you're listening to On Orbit, the podcast that asks, what's our future in space? Hi, Keith. Thanks for joining me today for On Orbit. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rachel. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. We're hearing so much about the topic of sovereignty right now, and we've seen a ramp up in investment this year in sovereign capabilities, especially in Europe. So I wanted to have you on to talk more about this issue and also how ST Engineering iDirect is contributing to building sovereign networks. So to get us started, just tell me a little bit about yourself and your role with ST Engineering iDirect.
Well, yeah, in this domain, I have quite the interesting background. I mean, I come from defense early in my career, but also ventured into robotics and artificial intelligence, and now back into the defense domain. But I'm pretty new to iDirect. I've been on board since November of last year, and so just coming up to 1 year. So this is my anniversary podcast, I guess.
Awesome.
And I'm Vice President of International Government Defense, so essentially strategy around government defense for iDirect, which is an area of growth for our organization. And it's quite exciting. It's exciting times, a lot going on. And sovereignty is just one of many dimensions. So really looking forward to discussing this.
Sounds good. So when we talk about sovereignty in the context of satellite communications, why is this becoming such a critical issue in today's geopolitical landscape?
Well, you mentioned geopolitical landscape, right? So that's just it. We're talking about isolationism more and more. Nations are putting in place policies that are meant to secure and reassure their populations. And what that does is the whole concept of national security is widening, right? So the more and more aspects of society are now part of national security. And it varies from country to country. But sovereignty in SATCOM in particular, because SATCOM is such an essential and core part of how information is communicated across a nation and within the government and defense domain, is highly strategic. Of course, that's a domain which sovereignty will become a key topic. If I can elaborate a bit by saying that, like in the SATCOM domain, really what nations that I speak with are looking for, they're looking really to more control, more security, and essentially ensure that satellite communications will always be up. So what that means is they don't want to be subject to swings in geopolitical positioning. They want to be able to have control over policy applied to their satellite network, the spectrum and how that's managed, the cryptography around the network, the data that goes to that network and how it's passed around, and even things that are more economic based, which is, for example, supply chain. These are key things that sometimes are even overlooked, but they're key for national security reasons. I guess nowadays, and why this is happening now, well, I mentioned some of them, but really everything right now in the government defense domain depends on space connectivity. And the space domain can now be also under threat in space and on the ground. So as a result, nations want to have control over their destiny and those aspects of their security.
Yeah, like you said, there are multiple dimensions to sovereignty, whether it's the supply chain, control of the network. But this doesn't mean that nations want every single satellite network that is operated in their country to be owned by that country, right?
No, absolutely not. In fact, that would be, well, first of all, it would cost a lot of money and take a whole lot of time. And it would definitely not be to their advantage. So really, it's about, and I'll talk maybe a little bit more about this later on, depending on where we go here. But it's really hybrid solutions are really what we need to expect moving forward. It's not about having full control over everything, but it's being able to fall back onto to operate in certain domains in a highly secure environment, in other domains in a more open environment, and have the benefits of both. Because there are benefits to having an open architecture, hosted network, and advantages to sovereignty as well. So you want both ultimately. And the question is about picking what works for your nation based on your policies, your geopolitical situation, your allies, and the situation around you, around your nation, of course, and the threats that you see coming towards you.
Yeah. So you mentioned threats there, and you mentioned cybersecurity in your first comments. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about what role sovereign SATCOM networks can mitigate, like how they can play a role in mitigating risks like cyber attacks or espionage?
Right. Well, one of the first things is you want in a sovereign network, you will look at assuring access to that network. So you want to have national control over points of access to the network, but also on bandwidth allocation. You want also to parse out parts of the network to isolate potential threats so that they don't bring down the entire network. So that's what we would talk attack surface reduction. So you want to bring that down. There are also architectures like zero trust, which we hear from certain nations. These are key elements. Then another component of it is being able to detect, right? So when you have a sovereign network, you can put in place your own ways of detecting threats, detecting intrusions, and have control over that. So these are all, they seem small things, but they matter when you're trying to optimize cost, time to market, and sovereign national security imperatives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the technological advancements in like the SATCOM space that are driving the development of these networks and making them possible?
Well, I mean, right now, one of the key things that is driving a lot of innovation are multi-orbit solutions out in the market, right? So we're talking about orchestration of multi-orbit architectures. And I mentioned earlier the hybrid nature of um, national network structures. Well, in a multi-orbit orchestration, you can imagine some orbits may be sovereign in nature and others may be hosted in nature. When I say hosted, non-sovereign, in different ways of approaching it. So for example, you may have some nations right now, I won't name them, but have LEO sovereign ambitions, but they still will be part of other networks that are across, let's say, regions like Europe. So, and those may have other constellations involved. So you have these hybrid models. So multi-orbit orchestration is a must, and being able to do it in a secure manner under the conditions of sovereign networks is a challenge in itself. Then there's the whole idea of protected waveforms, protecting that network, resilient networks. That's another area where sovereignty becomes a challenge because sometimes you don't have the skill set in your nation to develop a sovereign capability. So you need to develop that capability. So organizations and nations that are looking at sovereignty need to seriously consider, do I have the skill set? Do I have the manpower, the resources to develop this? Do I have to get it from somewhere else? And how do I implement that localization strategy that needs to accompany the sovereign network architecture? Sovereignty is not only in space, sovereign can be on the ground, and in fact, it should be because, and I just want to elaborate a little bit on this, is if you look at the space domain, your satellites can become targets. Recently at SDSS and a few other conferences, that was a common topic. The ground can be jammed as well. So there are vulnerabilities everywhere. So that sovereignty and the need to control that environment exists in both domains. So as I said, protected waveforms on the ground, anti-jamming, uh, low probability intercept and low probability detection, what we call LPI and LPD capabilities are key. Things like in the realm of in the domain of drones being a
Mhm.
threat, where we are now, low probability of geolocation, right? So being able your terminals not being targeted or your gateways not being targeted easily, that's also key. So these are all things that have to be considered. Crypto key management is the obvious one, which I'm just going to say because it's obvious that has to be considered. And again, that requires a special skill set. And the world is moving towards a virtual environment. We're not looking at a world of hardware in the future. So if you're considering a sovereign network architecture, you need to consider an architecture that will evolve with that kind of evolution of technology and move towards more of a software-defined network
Mhm.
and virtualization in the future. So that's not easy because you're in a transition period.
Yeah, you're describing some of the things that nations need to look at when they're thinking about architecting a sovereign network, and
Yep.
definitely some of the challenges there. Are the biggest challenges like affordability and the cost of building this out, or is it expertise and having that know-how within the country? How do you see those challenges?
Well, there's definitely a push and pull in what you just described. That's for sure. That's a very good area of a challenge. I would say that, and having worked in one specific nation on a sovereign program in my recent past, scope creep and proper management of implementation of a sovereign network is a big issue because it's highly political. And if you are too ambitious, initial starting point for most nations is I want to build everything myself from the bottom up. And then quickly that turns around and it's, yeah, well, maybe not. Maybe we'll look at partnering with other nations, or I'll look at my local industry and try to adopt technology they've come up with. But reality is in the end, it's often a mix of everything. Certain things, capabilities will be built up from the bottom up. Certain things will be off the shelf. Certain things will come from neighboring nations where you bring in their capability. So it can get pretty messy, and managing all that can be complex, right? But it's also the way of being going to market, getting ready in the market. It's not about profitability; it's about being ready for threats sooner than later. So that's also a big challenge. Is I want to feel secure. I want my nation to be secure, but I want it fairly quickly. I want it at a decent cost, but I also require to partner with many different moving parts that can actually evolve over time. You asked about skill set, if that's a key element. In many nations, it is. In many nations, they have some skill set and they're missing other big parts. So that's why any sovereign network needs to consider maybe an evolution over a long period of time. You're not going to go full sovereign with absolutely everything out of the gate. You may implement off the shelf capabilities and work on one aspect of sovereignty and then grow from there over a longer period of time. That's often the more reasonable and realistic approach.
Right, because as you said, it can take a really long time to get to that full capability.
Right. Yes.
What like size of nations are we talking about? Like, is this are smaller nations wanting sovereign networks and have more challenges to adopt, or you know, nations that are already leaders in space already have these networks? Can you just kind of talk to me about the landscape of
Yeah,
adoption?
absolutely. That's a great question. And that's actually makes our life complicated
Mhm.
as a company that's looking at tackling these solutions. You need to almost divide your solutions into tiers for those high touch nations that require a lot of localization, skill set development, very gradual approach. Those that are in somewhere in the middle ground where they have some knowledge, but not quite, or missing big components. And then you have those nations that have very solid, very developed industrial base, which comes with their own challenge because these companies and organizations often want to take a big chunk of control in this situation, and that's not always to the best interest of a government and defense organization and a sovereign capability. They all come with their challenges, but what I would say is they all have their solutions as well. So small nations nowadays, what we see is there's the small sat manufacturers community that can quickly get to market, provide satellite capability for which we can combine a ground segment that's sovereign in nature and fairly quickly have a capability in place. The issue with that, so that's the good news. The bad news to that is, well, a single small sat or a very small footprint of small sat satellites become a very easy target for if in case there is a conflict. So now I'm back to the multi-orbit diversification, connections to larger networks, and having a more diverse, resiliency through diversity is what I would call it, what we like to call it, solution for those kinds of nations. Those, if I move to the other extreme, those larger nations, they already have an infrastructure in place. They want to control a lot of that network. And then the government defense organizations are not always fully on board with that much control going to a commercial entity, right? So that's the other domain. But these large nations at least have the resources in place. So it actually can ensure that you get implementation a little bit faster for that nation specifically. What also happens though, Rachel, is these nations, because they're developed, they also often have allies around them and other countries that have agreements to share information. And often there's a need to bring them into the fold to some extent, right? And interoperate with those other nations. So a single nation a small nation that doesn't have much budget, typically they will either partner with a large nation for one aspect of the network and have their own architecture, and that works well. But the larger nations, there's always that push and pull of collaborating, operating with other smaller nations around them, and having full control over the network. Because they can, that becomes a push and pull, a dynamic in that nation, from what we've seen at this point in time.
Yeah, that's all really interesting about the different dynamics in different types of countries around the world. So I want to ask a little bit about how ST Engineering iDirect is contributing here. So how is the company working with governments, defense agencies, and private sectors to build these sovereign SATCOM networks around the world?
Well, first thing is we absolutely have to look at each nation on their own. There's no cookie cutter approach to sovereign networks. Every nation have their own geopolitical environment. They have their own existing install base, their own ambitions. And so we do approach each nation as their own special project. And what that means from a challenge perspective from our end is a lot of flexibility, a lot of adaptability required in how we approach the solutions to these problems. And luckily, iDirect is an organization that has been looking at these problems for a long time and currently has developed a framework that allows us to be flexible and adaptable to these kinds of needs from a modular and customization perspective. And how we're structuring it is as I mentioned earlier in your questioning before, is a tiered approach to the program. So because budgets ebb and flow, and often they don't always come in a very smooth way. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down, sometimes they disappear. They go on pause for a couple of years, depending on the government place, and then they come back. And sovereign programs are long-term programs. So it's very important that the model and the engagement with that nation take that into account and realize that we may have to scale up and down over time to implement a sovereign capability. So that tiered approach that I mentioned earlier and a scaled approach to implementation is key. It also reduces risk for the nation when they look at the programs because they know these things can happen. So if they see that is still part of the model moving forward, it's actually very reassuring for them. We also have to factor in the ecosystem of partners in countries. iDirect cannot go into a nation and say, we will give you a sovereign network because we are not necessarily from that nation.
Right.
So we need to partner with the ecosystem, and there are many ways to approach those partnerships. You need to partner with joint ventures as one. There's all kinds of ways of going about it. You can have IP agreements. And we are very flexible about that. So it's very important to be flexible about how you engage in country and the structure of your presence in country so that you can then transfer knowledge into that nation. And that's a third element that's key. The technology is there, it's available, it can be customized, you can partner, but you also need to transfer knowledge into that nation. Often they have some of the knowledge, but not all of it. So that's another element, and it's a risk for us because training resources is something that can be easy or very difficult. So I mentioned earlier there are high touch nations that are less developed, smaller nations often, or less developed resources in country. Those are high touch. That's a lot of localization. Some of those more developed countries with a stronger industrial base in the space segment, a little bit less transfer of knowledge, but there's still some. So that's another last element. And last, but definitely not least, meeting security and compliance certifications that apply to each one of these nations cannot overlook that. That's a key element in the process that has to be factored in and can sometimes be also time consuming.
Yeah. So as a ground segment provider and in like working in network orchestration, as Engineering iDirect, you would work with whoever the manufacturer is, whether it's within the country or another manufacturer, and just kind of the different players in the value chain.
Yes, no, absolutely. So and it can be we could partner with a satellite operator
Hmm.
or with a prime or simply with an up and coming organization in the country that is a superstar in that small country and has high ambitions and that the government has decided they want to support and develop. It can take all of these forms. So it's not necessarily one size fits all. Not all nations actually have a large satellite operator operating in their country. Sometimes you need to build there's a lot of transfer knowledge needed into a smaller organization. So again, the model that we take has to really adapt to all of those potential realities.
Awesome. And then how do you work to address the unique requirements of these networks, and what types of requirements are you seeing from countries?
Right. Well, one thing about sovereign networks is this is a long-term implementation. So it
Yeah.
has to, the nation needs to feel that whatever is implemented is future-proof. Because of the amounts of money invested, it's very important that the future-proofing of the solution and scalability, adaptability to new technologies that we see coming in the future. I'm going to use quantum computing, for example, as one good example. After in the crypto world, for example, will absolutely be something we know is coming. So if you're approaching a
Yeah.
sovereign solution in a nation and you're ignoring quantum technology in your cycle of development, and there's no avenues towards it, then you may be doing that nation not doing that nation a favor, and that may be an issue. So that's a key element. So security, I just touched on one right there. So and keying, national keying, of course, and these are standards, table stakes things, but they can be complex. I mentioned the zero trust
Hmm.
management of the network, being able to then also monitor that network, audit the network. So all these things from a security perspective will evolve over time because the threats will evolve over time, and that future proofing has to fit those domains. Of course, I talked about virtualizing the network and everything moving towards software. So that's scalability, because by virtualizing the network, you're now enabling scalability in the future. So that is going to be an element that will be key. If everything is hardware based, scalability is obviously going to be harder. If we're moving to a virtualized world and software defined world, then scalability becomes easier. Now, software comes with its own challenges, of course. There's scope creep and all of the things I mentioned earlier as some other risks. But that's why having a packaged, framed solution that is customizable reduces that risk. Because now we're framing the software development, we're framing the modules that we're making sovereign. They're picking and choosing the sovereign elements that they need out of a menu of modules that need to be brought under the sovereign umbrella. And those elements are the ones that will be considered. So we frame the problem from a virtualization standpoint. So that's going to be important as well. Last, I would say resiliency for as that has to be future proofed, right? So because as I mentioned earlier, the threats will from a quantum domain, for example, we need to be able to adapt there. But also multi-orbit policy and how that will scale over time. That has to be considered. Um, I mentioned anti-jamming, being able to, and supply chain, right? So these are all things that affect resilience of the network. If I'm not able to receive parts or make
Yeah.
systems, maintain them in a very effective manner, well, guess what? My network's not very resilient. So it really goes all the way down there. And that's where the sovereignty comes into play, localization, transfer of technology. Those are on joint ventures and partnering in nations actually ensure that. So you can see the complexity that's built around that.
Yeah, and I could see the future proofing being particularly important because you don't want to get locked into a capability. And with how many satellites have been launched in the last few years, like the industry is always changing, new terminals, new
Yes.
interoperability standards. Like you don't want a country to get locked into an old system. So,
Definitely not if you spent, because sovereign programs are expensive programs. So not when you spent that money politically, that's definitely not a positive. That's for sure.
yes.
Yeah.
What countries do you see as leading the way in developing sovereign networks?
Well, I would say that the U.S. is just from sheer investment power are clearly a model, and they've been developing sovereign capability for decades. And in the space domain now, even in the current trends, I would say they're definitely still leading that charge. Um, if I move from the U.S. to Europe, the UK, France, Germany are your obvious big players that are have mature sovereign what I call mil satcom ambitions, and they're not shy about it. It's very clear. They have strong industrial players to support those initiatives, and they're also part of multinational initiatives for sovereign capabilities that are more regional in nature. So you can already see them having national sovereign capability mixed with multinational sovereign capabilities mixed together. What does that open up? That opens up a situation where you want to have multiple waveforms operating in your same network. And it's very important to look at ways of how that can be architectured so that you're able to operate on your sovereign platform, but then move over to a shared multinational waveform and network seamlessly. And that is something iDirect has gone to market recently with the 4 Series 5450 modem technology. And that's something that we're developing over multiple years with nations, being part of IRIS Square, European Protected Waveform programs, and other sovereign uh, network programs. It's given us the insight to make sure that the hardware platforms, for the time being, until they become virtualized, also support multiple waveform
Mm-hmm.
architectures. Now, your question was about other leading
Hmm.
countries. And I mentioned some obvious ones, which happen to be the big ones, but there are some smaller ones that have definitely very serious ambitions. I would say South Korea is definitely a nation that has ambitions. Japan, even Australia, which they have Australian industry content requirements. If you're going to go into that country and have a major program in place, they will have their sovereign requirements. I work out of Canada. My own country has its own sovereign capabilities, which didn't exist just 2 years ago. So things can evolve and change very, very quickly. There are nations in the Middle East that have definitely very serious ambitions and the budgets to cover it. And in their case, it's more about developing resource and know-how, whereas others, it's all about security. So again, the reasons vary.
Yeah, and we're also seeing this not just in SATCOM, but in Earth observation too. There's been a huge ramp up this year in countries buying either their own Earth observation satellite, or particularly in the Middle East, the joint ventures and doing assembly integration in the Middle East and those types of partnerships. So that's
Absolutely. If
interesting.
you look at the Nordic region, with the Arctic becoming more and more important, Earth observation, but also satcom sovereignty is key there as well. And some of the constellations in place now, and the multi-orbit solutions in place being considered for sovereign capabilities factor in that Arctic problem or challenge. And you see nations actually joining forces to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking to the future, do you think that sovereign networks will become the norm?
Um, I think that several nations will at least have aspirations to a hybrid future where you would have shared or hosted network and sovereign capabilities. I believe that some nations may stand out and then have their own sovereign network and then move it towards a multinational um, configuration depending on their geopolitical situation, but then build in means and ways to then secure if things change again in the future. So simply because they'll have vested interest financially in doing so, if they've invested in a sovereign network. In some cases, it may make sense that they have the trust that over medium and long period of time that a relationship with a nation nearby may be safe enough to share. So that I think we'll see that happening. Um, I think what we'll also see is nations will be looking at table stakes levers of technology transfer into their nation. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is more sovereign nations develop sovereign network capabilities. There will be standards or expectations that are table stakes, and it may simplify the process of implementing a sovereign network. When right now everything is emerging, right? And what happens is there's unknowns, companies, organizations, nations, they feel there's a lot of risk. But as we see these programs get implemented, that risk will be perceived less simply because there's more experience from the different stakeholders that supply these solutions or neighboring nations that have implemented it before. And now we feel that the risk is less, and we may see that pick up. But I do feel there will always be a hybrid future on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned isolationism in your remarks at the beginning, and I wanted to follow up on that about if everyone is kind of building up their own sovereign networks, could that lead to a more fragmented or isolated global communications ecosystem?
It can for a temporary period of time. No nation wants to be isolated completely. So first of all, there's not a single nation that thinks that, well, very, very few nations believe that they will address conflict on their own. Um, over the last 5 years, I've been spending a lot of time in the States, and if you listen to the generals, admirals, etc., they will say that every theater in the world moving forward into the future will be coalition-based theaters. So you need to have interoperability. So I do feel that because of the interoperability element, um, we their sovereignty will be key, but there will always need to be an openness towards standards-based networks that can be built upon that enable interoperability. So you can have a sovereign network that's based on standards that another nation also adopts and adapts for sovereign requirements. A sovereign network's not always top to bottom sovereign in nature. Elements of it can be sovereign. So we're not talking necessarily about completely isolating ourselves. And I would say it's more about the other way around. It's about isolationism from a geopolitical standpoint, it's creating a need to have more sovereign capability, but not necessarily fully sovereign networks from top to bottom. So because everyone does realize that interoperability and theaters currently and in the future will require coalition forces.
The interoperability almost gives it the best of both worlds of
Yes,
your own network and working with others also.
absolutely. And it's a must. You won't be able to get away from it. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And then my last question is about the role of private companies like ST Engineering, iDirect. So, do you see any risk that the ramp up in sovereign networks would stifle innovation in the private sector, or is this an opportunity for private companies to work with different countries around the world?
Yeah, so it's absolutely an opportunity, and I assume you guessed I would say that.
Yeah.
Uh, it's an opportunity, but it's an opportunity if you have the vision. And what do I mean by having the vision? If you're going to build a solution that can be flexible, adaptable, scalable enough, modular enough to address all the things we just described, this very cherry picky character of sovereign programs is such that every element of your network needs to be considered in isolation from a sovereign perspective, because they may not need, as I said, the whole capability. They may only want cryptography to be sovereign. They may want a certain element of bandwidth to be sovereign. They may want the whole thing to be sovereign, or maybe the objective is more about localization and resource development in the nation, and the waveform they'll just use, but they really want to, make their own hardware. Some nations, that's where they're at. It really depends on the nation. So the the risk is from the beginning of your development, you have to factor in that flexibility, that scalability in your solution. Luckily, at iDirect, we've done exactly that. In fact, it's one of the reasons I joined the organization, is because the vision was there to go to market with a platform that was future-proof, that had the flexibility to adapt to the changes that we could see at this point in time in the future from a technology standpoint. It was moving towards virtualization. It was moving towards software-defined networks, which gives us the flexibility to adapt to things like sovereign networks, amongst other things. Multi-orbit solutions, of course, the architecture was built around knowing that was happening with intuition. And even on the hardware front, as we transition towards a virtual world in the future, on the hardware front, having the ability to support multiple waveforms, whether they be sovereign or not, and having both and having multiple waveforms on the same modem platform is key. That to provide that flexibility in the meantime, because you can't wait 5 years to have a capability. Nations need the capability today, so that when we get to that point in the future where we have a sovereign software capability, we've actually bridged the threat gap between now and then.
Yeah, and like adapting over time, like we
Right.
were talking about, and like dealing with the threats today, being future proof for the threats of the future.
And we just don't know what will come up, right, in the near future. Who knows geopolitically, technology wise? So again, we don't have a crystal ball. We haven't necessarily forecasted everything into the future, but we definitely have factored in, I feel, as many of the variables as possible that are known today for the next 5 to 10 years, for sure, for at least from a sovereign network perspective.
Yeah. Well, Keith, this has been such an engaging conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is key in the domain of sovereign networks is to spend good amount of time with end users,
Hmm.
and understanding the operational realities first, and then working with local partners in those countries to see how can we implement a solution with the means within that country, with those partners, to address the needs. So iDirect is more than happy to engage with those partners and engage with those end users to address these needs and these problems that are fundamental. And it's exciting times. Technology is there, the will is there. Now we just need to get together, make sure that we're communicating across borders to make this happen.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. It's been great talking with you.
All right, thank you, Rachel. It was my pleasure.